The last door in Red Hollow slammed so hard that the wooden frame shook, and 8-year-old Caleb Morgan looked up at his mother with fear in his tired eyes. "Mama, where will we sleep tonight?" he asked. Sarah Morgan held his small hand tighter, though her own fingers were numb from the cold. She had no answer. Behind them, evening shadows stretched across the muddy street, and the wind carried the smell of snow from the distant Colorado mountains. Sarah had only 35 cents left, one worn suitcase, and a son who had been coughing for 3 weeks. By morning, she feared they might have nowhere left to go. 3 months earlier, Sarah had still been a wife with a small home in the mining settlement of Ashford Ridge. Her husband, Daniel, worked deep beneath the mountain, digging silver from narrow tunnels where the air was thin and the darkness never ended. One October morning, part of the mine collapsed. 6 men were buried. Daniel was one of them. The company did not recover his body. They gave Sarah a folded coat, his pocket watch, and 2 weeks to leave the company house. She sold the bed, the table, Daniel's tools, and nearly every dress she owned. She bought 2 stage tickets west, hoping a larger town might offer work. Instead, the stage left her and Caleb in Red Hollow, a place of 3 muddy streets, 1 church, a saloon, a feed store, and people who had already heard that she was poor before she finished asking for help. The first boarding house refused children. The second refused widows without references. The third woman looked at Caleb's pale face and said she would not risk sickness under her roof. Sarah did not beg. She thanked each person, turned away, and kept walking. She had learned that some people became colder when they saw desperation. She would not give them the pleasure of watching her break. Now darkness was falling, and Caleb's cough had returned. They entered the feed store because it was warm. A gray-haired shopkeeper named Walter Price stood behind the counter, counting nails into small paper sacks. He watched Sarah set down the suitcase. He watched Caleb move close to the stove and hold his hands toward the heat. "I am looking for work," Sarah said. "I can cook, clean, sew, wash clothes, and manage a household. I am not asking for charity." Walter's eyes moved toward the window. Snow had begun falling in soft white pieces. "Not many people hire this late in the year," he said. "Someone must need help." He rubbed his jaw, then looked at Caleb again. "There is a ranch east of town," he said. "Belongs to a man named Luke Bennett. His wife died 5 years ago. He keeps cattle and 4 hired hands. They say his kitchen is worse than his barn." "Does he need a cook?" "He needs one. Whether he knows it is another matter." "How far?" "Nearly 5 miles. Sarah looked outside. The snow was coming faster now. Walter noticed her expression. "You cannot walk that road tonight." "I cannot stay here tonight either." He studied her for a long moment, then took an old wool blanket from beneath the counter and placed it beside the suitcase. "You can return it later." Sarah understood that it was not only a blanket. It was the closest thing to kindness she had received all day. She wrapped it around Caleb and thanked him. Then she lifted the suitcase and stepped back into the cold. The road east of Red Hollow passed through open land where the wind had nothing to stop it. Snow gathered on Sarah's shoulders and in Caleb's hair. Twice he stumbled. Twice she pulled him upright and told him they were almost there, though she could not see any buildings ahead. "Mama," Caleb said after they had walked a long time, "what if he says no?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Then we keep walking." "To where?" She looked at the road disappearing beneath the snow. "Somewhere," she said. Caleb did not ask again. At last, a light appeared beyond a line of bare trees, then another. A large barn rose from the darkness, followed by a 2-story ranch house with smoke coming from the chimney. Fences crossed the white ground, and cattle stood together near a sheltered corral. Sarah nearly cried when she saw the smoke. A young ranch hand stepped from the barn as they entered the yard. He wore a heavy brown coat and carried a lantern. "You lost," he called. "I am looking for Mr. Luke Bennett." The man stared at the suitcase, then at Caleb. "He is in the barn." Sarah took her son's hand and crossed the yard. The barn door stood partly open. Inside, horses shifted in their stalls, and warm air carried the smell of hay and leather. A man sat beneath a hanging lantern, repairing a saddle strap. He was broad-shouldered, perhaps 42, with dark hair touched by gray, and a face shaped by weather, work, and years of silence. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows despite the cold. His hands moved carefully over the leather until he heard Sarah enter. Then they stopped. Luke Bennett looked at her without standing. "Can I help you?" "My name is Sarah Morgan. Walter Price in town said you might need someone to run your kitchen." Luke's expression changed slightly. "Walter talks too much. He talked enough to send me here." Luke looked at Caleb. The boy stood close to his mother, wrapped in the borrowed blanket, trying hard not to cough. Sarah stepped forward. "My husband died in a mine collapse 3 months ago. We arrived in Red Hollow today. Every boarding house turned us away. I can cook, clean, preserve food, mend clothes, keep accounts, and care for sick men if needed. I will work for fair wages and a room for my son. I am not asking you to feel sorry for us." The barn became very quiet. Luke looked at her wet dress, her worn shoes, and the suitcase she had carried 5 miles through the snow. Then his eyes returned to Caleb. "What is your name, boy?" "Caleb Morgan, sir." "How old are you?" "8." Luke nodded toward a small wooden bucket near the wall. A barn cat sat beside it, watching Caleb with yellow eyes. "Cats usually run from strangers," Luke said. Caleb slowly crouched and held out his hand. He waited without moving. After a moment, the cat stepped closer and rubbed against his fingers. Something softened in Luke's face. He stood and placed the saddle strap on the workbench. "The kitchen is a disaster," he said. "The stove smokes. The pantry is nearly empty. My men can ruin beans in 3 different ways." "I can fix a kitchen." "There is a small room behind it, 1 bed and a narrow cot. The window leaks cold air." "It has walls." Luke looked at her. "Yes. Then it is better than what we have." For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved, though the expression vanished almost at once. "You can begin tomorrow morning." Sarah looked toward the darkness outside. "I can begin tonight." Luke studied her again. Then he picked up the lantern. "Follow me." The kitchen was worse than Sarah had imagined. Dirty pans covered the table. Flour had spilled beneath a cabinet. A broken chair leaned against the wall, and the stove carried months of black grease. One ranch hand had left a pair of muddy gloves beside the bread tin. Caleb stood in the doorway. "Can you fix this, Mama?" Sarah removed her wet coat and tied an old apron around her waist. "Yes," she said, "light that lamp." She found beans, cornmeal, salt pork, onions, and enough flour for biscuits. She built the stove fire, cleaned 2 pans, swept a place beside the table, and began cooking. The smell moved through the house. One by one, the ranch hands appeared in the doorway. 4 tired men stared at the pot of beans, the frying meat, and the biscuits rising near the stove as though they had discovered gold. Luke entered last. He took his place at the head of the table while Sarah served the meal. Caleb sat near the wall, eating quietly. No one spoke for the first several minutes. They were too busy eating. Finally, the youngest hand looked at his second biscuit and said, "I forgot food could taste like this." Another man kicked him beneath the table. Sarah almost smiled. Luke looked at the warm kitchen, the full plates, and the boy sitting beneath his roof. Something unreadable passed through his gray eyes. After supper, he showed Sarah the small back room. It held a bed, a child's cot, an old chest, and a cracked window that whistled whenever the wind rose. "I will repair the glass tomorrow," Luke said. "We will be fine tonight." He paused at the door. "You walked 5 miles in that storm." "Yes." "With the boy." "Yes." Luke looked at Caleb, who had already placed his wooden horse on the cot. Then he looked back at Sarah. "You will not have to walk back," he said. He left before she could answer. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind strike the walls. Caleb slept deeply beside her, warm for the first time in days. From somewhere down the hall came the slow sound of Luke's boots, then silence. Sarah stared into the darkness. She had found work, she had found shelter, she had found a kitchen that needed her. But something in Luke Bennett's eyes told her that this house held more than dust and loneliness. It held a sorrow no one spoke about, and Sarah had a feeling that before winter ended, that sorrow would either send her away or change all three of their lives forever. By the end of Sarah Morgan's first week at Bennett Ranch, the kitchen no longer smelled of burned grease and old smoke. The shelves were scrubbed. The flour tins were labeled. The pantry had been sorted into neat rows of beans, cornmeal, dried apples, coffee, molasses, and salt. The broken chair had been repaired by one of the ranch hands, and the muddy gloves had vanished from the bread table after Sarah placed them on Luke's supper plate without saying a word. No one left gloves there again. The men began arriving for meals early. The youngest ranch hand, Jacob Reed, appeared every morning 10 minutes before breakfast and pretended he needed water. Amos Clark, the oldest hand, started splitting extra firewood for the kitchen stove. Even quiet Samuel Pike, who rarely spoke unless cattle or weather required it, began taking his plate to the wash basin after supper. Sarah noticed everything. She always had. That was how she had survived Daniel's death. That was how she had kept Caleb fed while selling every piece of their old life. She watched what people needed before they admitted needing it. Luke noticed her watching. He did not mention it, but his eyes followed the changes around the house. Sometimes he stood in the kitchen doorway as if he had entered the wrong home. On the fourth morning, Sarah found him sitting at the table before sunrise. She had already built the stove fire and started coffee. Outside, the ranch was covered in fresh snow, blue beneath the early light. Luke held Caleb's wooden horse in his hands. One of its legs had broken. Sarah stopped. That belonged to his father. I guessed. Luke turned the horse over carefully. Daniel had carved it when Caleb was 5. The body was rough, the legs uneven, and one ear slightly larger than the other. Caleb had carried it through the mine settlement, onto the stage, and along the 5-mile road through the snow. He did not tell me it was broken, Sarah said. Boys do not always tell their mothers when something important breaks. She looked at Luke. His attention remained on the toy. I can repair it, he said, if you are willing. It is not mine to decide. Luke nodded. Caleb entered a few minutes later, hair untidy and shirt half-buttoned. He stopped when he saw the horse in Luke's hands. I found it near the barn, Luke said. Thought I might fix that leg. Caleb looked at the floor. My papa made it. I know. You cannot make it the same. No, Luke said, but I can make it strong enough to stand. Caleb considered this. Then he crossed the kitchen and placed the toy in Luke's large hand. All right. Luke repaired it that afternoon. He reinforced all 4 legs and rubbed the wood with oil until the little horse looked warmer than before. He left it on Caleb's cot without saying anything. The following morning, Caleb followed him into the barn. Sarah watched from the kitchen window. Caleb did not bother Luke. He stood quietly nearby, handing him tools when asked and sweeping loose straw from the work area. Luke showed him how to hold a bridle, how to check a horse's hoof, and how to move slowly around nervous animals. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. Sarah turned away from the window, but looked back again before reaching the table. The sight hurt in a way she had not expected. Daniel should have been the man teaching Caleb those things. Yet grief did not change what a child needed. That realization frightened her. Luke began taking coffee in the kitchen every morning. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he only sat while Sarah prepared breakfast. The silence between them slowly changed. At first, it had been the silence of strangers. Now it felt like the silence of 2 people who understood that words were not always the best way to keep someone company. One cold morning, Luke placed his cup on the table and said, her name was Rebecca. Sarah did not ask who he meant. How long ago? 5 years. What happened? Fever. His voice did not change, but his fingers tightened around the cup. There was a doctor in Red Hollow. He came too late, said he had been delayed at another ranch. Sarah cut biscuit dough into circles. Were you happy? Luke looked toward the dark window. We were learning how. She understood that answer better than a simple yes. Daniel and I argued about money, she said. About the mine, about whether we should leave before it killed him. Luke looked at her. He kept saying 1 more year, Sarah continued. 1 more good season and we would buy land somewhere. He believed the mountain would give us enough to escape it. But it did not. No. The stove fire cracked. Luke looked down at his coffee. I am sorry. So am I. The words were simple, but something moved between them. Not romance. Not yet. Recognition. 2 people who had loved, lost, and continued, because continuing had been demanded of them. The peace of the following days ended when a wagon arrived from Red Hollow. Sarah saw it from the kitchen window. A heavy-set man stepped down wearing a black coat and polished boots. His face was round, his smile wide, and his eyes cold. Luke met him in the yard. The ranch hands stopped working. Sarah knew immediately that this was not a friendly visit. The man spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry. Bennett, heard you took in the Morgan widow. Luke's shoulders stiffened. I hired a cook. Same woman whose husband owed my store $170. Sarah's hand froze above the bread dough. The man turned his head slightly toward the house, making it clear he knew she was listening. Name is Victor Hale, he called, in case the widow forgot. Sarah had not forgotten. Victor Hale had owned the supply store in Ashford Ridge before opening a second business in Red Hollow. Daniel had bought mining equipment and winter food on credit. Sarah had never seen the full account. Luke's voice remained calm. Her husband's debt is not hers. Depends how the town sees it. I do not care how the town sees it. Victor's smile narrowed. You might when your cattle contracts begin passing to other men. Reputation matters. Luke stepped closer. Are you threatening my business? I am offering friendly advice. You came 5 miles in snow to offer it. The yard became silent. Victor looked toward the kitchen again. A widow under a lonely man's roof gives people ideas. Luke's face changed. Sarah had seen his quietness before. She had mistaken it for softness. Now she understood it was control. Sarah Morgan works here, Luke said. Her son lives here. There is nothing shameful in either fact. People may disagree. Then people can do their disagreeing somewhere else. Victor's smile disappeared. You think carefully, Bennett. I already have. Luke pointed toward the road. Victor climbed into his wagon without another word. Sarah remained in the kitchen until the sound of the wheels faded. When Luke entered for lunch, she placed his plate on the table. I heard him. I expected you did. If my presence causes trouble for your ranch, Caleb and I can leave. Luke looked up sharply. No. The force of the answer startled her. Luke, you walked here through a snowstorm because no one in town would open a door. I opened mine because I needed help and you needed work. Nothing about that is dishonest. But your contracts are my concern. He may damage your name. Luke stood. My name survived 5 years of people calling me a bitter widower. It can survive being accused of feeding a woman and her child. Sarah stared at him. He lowered his voice. You are not leaving because Victor Hale wants you afraid. She wanted to argue. Instead, she looked toward the barn where Caleb was brushing a quiet mare under Amos's supervision. He has already lost 1 home, Luke said. Do not make him lose another because of a coward's gossip. The words struck deep. Sarah turned away. You should have asked whether I considered this home. Luke was silent. Then he said, do you? She did not answer. Not because she did not know. Because she was afraid that she did. That evening, Caleb sat beside her while she mended one of his shirts. Are we leaving? He asked. No. Mr. Hale said bad things. He did. Mr. Bennett made him go. Yes. Caleb thought for a moment. I like it here. Sarah kept sewing. What do you like? The horses, Amos. Jacob tells bad jokes. He does. And Mr. Bennett does not get angry when I make mistakes. Sarah's hand paused. Caleb lowered his voice. I think he is lonely. Sarah looked at her son. What makes you say that? He sits in the kitchen even when he is not hungry. Children saw the truth before adults found names for it. Sarah folded the shirt. Go to bed. Caleb obeyed, but his words remained. The next trouble came 3 days later. Jacob returned from town with supplies and a bruise beneath his eye. Luke saw it immediately. What happened? Nothing. Jacob. The young man looked toward Sarah, then away. Some men at the saloon were talking about Mrs. Morgan. I told them to stop. Luke's jaw tightened. Sarah placed the flour sack on the table. You fought over gossip. They said things they had no right to say. And now they will say more. Jacob looked ashamed. I am sorry, ma'am. Sarah sighed. Did you win? Jacob blinked. Amos coughed to hide a laugh. Jacob touched his bruised eye. Mostly. Then wash up, supper is nearly ready. Later, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Caleb was asleep, Sarah found Luke on the porch. Snow covered the yard, the moon shone above the barn roof. You cannot fight the whole town, she said. I am not trying to. Your men are. They care about you. They barely know me. Luke looked toward the kitchen window glowing behind her. They know what the house was before you came. Sarah waited. Luke continued quietly. It had stopped feeling like a house. The cold wind moved between them. What did it feel like? A place where men slept between work. She looked through the window. The clean table stood beneath the lamp. Caleb's drawing of the barn hung beside the pantry. A loaf of bread cooled near the stove. And now, she asked. Luke looked at her. Now I notice when I come home. Her breath caught. He looked away first. Sarah knew she should return inside. Instead, she remained beside him. I cannot replace Rebecca, she said. I know. And you cannot replace Daniel. I know that too. Then what is happening here? Luke's eyes returned to hers. I do not know. It was the most honest answer he could have given. A horse cried sharply inside the barn. Luke turned at once. They ran across the yard together. Inside, the gray mare Caleb loved was on the ground, kicking weakly. Amos knelt beside her, his face grim. Colic, he said, bad. Caleb stood near the stall in his nightshirt and boots, tears on his face. Save her, he begged. Luke entered the stall. Get the boy back. Sarah pulled Caleb toward her, but he resisted. Please, Mr. Bennett. Luke looked at him. For one moment, something painful and old crossed his face. Then he removed his coat, rolled his sleeves, and knelt beside the suffering animal. We are going to try, he said. The next 2 hours were filled with sweat, fear, warm water, medicine, and desperate walking. Luke and Amos kept the mare moving while Sarah heated cloths and Caleb stood at the stall door, refusing to leave. At last, near midnight, the mare settled. Her breathing eased. Luke leaned against the stall wall, exhausted. She may live, he said. We will know by morning. Caleb crossed the stall slowly. Then, without warning, he threw his arms around Luke. Luke went completely still. Sarah saw the shock in his face. Caleb held him tightly. Thank you. Luke looked at Sarah over the boy's shoulder. His hands hovered for a moment. Then he placed one gently against Caleb's back. Something broke open in Sarah's chest. Not grief. Not only grief. Hope, perhaps. Dangerous, unwanted, impossible hope. And as she watched the lonely rancher hold her son beneath the yellow barn lantern, Sarah understood that Victor Hale was no longer the greatest threat to her new life. The greatest threat was the truth she could no longer deny. She was beginning to care whether Luke Bennett wanted them to stay. The gray mare survived the night. By morning, she was standing again, weak but alert, while Caleb sat outside her stall with a blanket around his shoulders and refused to leave until she ate. Luke came into the kitchen just after sunrise. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were tired, and there was dried mud on one sleeve. Sarah placed coffee in front of him. "She is going to live," he said. "I know. You know." Caleb came in 10 minutes ago and announced it as though he had personally defeated death. The corner of Luke's mouth lifted. "That sounds like him." Sarah sat across from him. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Luke looked down at his hands. "I was not prepared for him to do that." "To hug you." He nodded. Sarah waited. Luke stared at the steam rising from his coffee. "Rebecca and I wanted children," he said. "We tried for years, it never happened." Sarah's expression softened. "I am sorry. After she died, I told myself it was better that way. Easier, nothing else to lose." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "That was a lie." Sarah said nothing. Luke looked toward the hallway where Caleb had disappeared. "He looks at me like I know what I am doing. Most children believe that about adults." "Do you?" She met his eyes. "Sometimes." The answer made him almost smile again. Then his expression changed. "Sarah, there is something I need to tell you." She felt the seriousness in his voice. "What?" "Victor Hale is not acting alone." She went still. Luke leaned forward. "There is a rancher north of here named Silas Crowley. He has been trying to buy my eastern pasture for 2 years. That land holds the best spring on this side of Red Hollow." "And you refused?" "Every time." Luke wrapped his hands around the cup. "Crowley owns contracts with most of the freight companies. Hale supplies half the town. Between them, they can make business difficult for anyone who stands against them." Sarah thought of the wagon in the yard, the gossip in the saloon, the threats disguised as advice. "They want your land." "Yes. And they think forcing me out will weaken you." Luke looked at her steadily. "They think scandal will make me desperate enough to sell." Sarah stood and walked to the stove. Anger moved through her, cold and exact. "Then they have misunderstood both of us." Luke watched her. "Sarah, this may become worse." It was already worse when Caleb and I were standing in the snow with 35 cents. He rose. "I will not let them harm you." She turned. "You do not get to decide alone what I can survive." The words landed hard. Luke's face tightened. "I did not mean. I know what you meant. You meant to protect us." "Yes. But protection is not the same as making choices for me." He looked away. Sarah stepped closer. "I lost my husband. I lost my home. I crossed the territory with a sick child and no promise waiting at the end. Do not mistake my fear for weakness." Luke looked at her again. "I do not." "Then stop speaking as though you are the only person standing between this house and disaster." The kitchen was silent. Then Luke nodded slowly. "All right." Sarah expected an argument. Instead, he said, "What do you think we should do?" The question changed everything. Not because it was dramatic. Because he meant it. Sarah returned to the table. "We need to know what Hale claims Daniel owed. I can send for a lawyer. And we need to know whether Crowley's pressure on your contracts is legal." Luke sat again. "You know someone." "No, but Walter Price knows every piece of news in Red Hollow before it happens. Jacob knows every man who has been thrown out of every saloon between here and Denver. Amos has worked this county longer than either of us." Luke considered that. "You want to ask the ranch hands." "I want to use the people we have." Something moved in his expression. "You make it sound simple." It is not simple, it is practical. By noon, the kitchen table had become a council room. Walter Price rode out from town. Amos brought old account books. Jacob supplied names, rumors, and several details no respectable man should have known but which proved useful. Samuel Pike, who rarely spoke, revealed that his brother-in-law worked in the county records office. Within 2 days, they had a name. Henry Wallace, a lawyer in the town of Millstone, who specialized in land contracts and debt disputes. Luke rode there before dawn. Sarah wrapped biscuits, salt pork, and coffee in cloth for the journey. At the door, he paused. "I will be back by tomorrow night. We will manage." "I know." He looked toward the barn where Caleb was already working beside Amos. Then he looked back at her. "Lock the doors after dark." She lifted one eyebrow. "Luke, I know I am not deciding for you." "Good. Lock them anyway." This time she smiled. "I will." Luke returned the following evening carrying a leather folder and the first real hope they had seen. Henry Wallace had examined the available records. Victor Hale's debt claim was incomplete. No signed agreement connected Sarah personally to Daniel's store account. More importantly, a county law limited the collection of mining debts after a worker's death unless the merchant had filed a claim within 60 days. Hale had waited nearly 3 months. "He cannot take your wages," Luke said. Sarah let out a breath. "And Crowley. Wallace believes interfering with my cattle contracts could be treated as restraint of trade if we can prove it." "Can we?" "Not yet." The relief faded slightly. Luke opened the folder. "There is something else. Crowley recently purchased land along Willow Creek. He may be planning to redirect part of the water before spring. That would hurt your eastern pasture. It could destroy it." Sarah looked toward the dark window. So the gossip was only the beginning. "Yes." Luke watched her face. "You can still leave." She looked at him. He lifted one hand before she could respond. "I am not asking you to. I am telling you the truth. You have a choice." Sarah held his gaze. "So do you." "What choice?" "To stop assuming. I am waiting for an excuse to go." Luke did not answer. Sarah closed the folder. "I told Caleb this was home." Something changed in Luke's eyes. "You said that?" "Yes." "When?" "The night Victor Hale came." Luke stood very still. "And did you mean it?" Sarah felt the question move through her. She could have avoided it. She had avoided many things since Daniel's death. But she was tired of living as though every honest feeling were a danger. "Yes," she said, "I meant it." Luke breathed out slowly. Before he could speak, someone pounded on the front door. 3 hard knocks. Everyone in the kitchen stopped. Luke crossed the hall and opened it. Victor Hale stood outside with a deputy and a folded paper. His expression was pleased. "Luke Bennett," he said, "I have an order authorizing seizure of wages owed to Sarah Morgan under the unpaid estate debt of Daniel Morgan." Sarah came into the hall. The deputy looked uncomfortable. Luke took the paper. He read it once. Then he handed it back. "This is not valid." The county clerk signed it. "The county clerk has not seen the full record." Victor smiled. "The order stands until a judge says otherwise." Luke stepped onto the porch. "You came to my house after dark to frighten a widow. I came to collect what I am owed." Sarah moved beside Luke. "No," she said, "you came because you believed I had no proof." Victor's smile weakened. Sarah continued. "My husband made a payment to your Ashford Ridge account 6 months before he died. $140. Victor became still. Luke turned toward her. "You have a receipt." "In my suitcase." Victor's eyes sharpened. Sarah went to the back room and returned with the small metal box she had carried from the mining settlement. Inside were Daniel's papers, old letters, receipts, and the final records of a life destroyed too quickly. She found the payment slip. Henry Wallace had taught Luke what to look for. The receipt carried Hale's store stamp and the signature of his former clerk. Sarah held it up. "You claimed $170, she said. "This receipt reduces the debt to 30, and you did not file within 60 days. The deputy looked at Victor. Victor's face darkened. "That proves nothing." "It proves enough for a courtroom," Luke said. "And if we go to court, Wallace will ask why this payment disappeared from your records." Victor looked from the receipt to Luke, then toward the deputy. The deputy removed his hat. "Mr. Hale, I believe this matter requires review." Victor said nothing for several seconds. Then he snatched the paper from the deputy's hand. "This is not finished." Sarah stepped forward. "It is finished for tonight." Victor looked at her with open hatred. For the first time, she did not feel smaller beneath it. He turned and walked back to his wagon. The deputy apologized before following. Luke closed the door. The whole house remained silent. Caleb stood at the end of the hallway in his nightshirt. "Are they taking us away?" he asked. Sarah went to him immediately. "No." "Are you sure?" She knelt and took his face in her hands. "Yes, I am sure." Caleb looked past her at Luke. Luke crouched beside them. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said. Caleb studied him. "Promise." Luke did not hesitate. "I promise." The following week changed Red Hollow. Henry Wallace filed a formal challenge to Hale's debt claim. He also requested a full review of the missing payment. Hale withdrew his claim before the hearing. That alone would have been enough. But Samuel's brother-in-law found something else in the county records. Silas Crowley had filed a request to alter the water channel along Willow Creek without notifying Luke, even though the change would affect Bennett land. The request had been approved by a clerk who happened to owe Victor Hale a large personal debt. The evidence was not dramatic. It was paperwork. Dates, signatures, maps, payments. But Sarah understood better than most that paper could hold the truth when powerful men expected the truth to disappear. The court suspended Crowley's water request. His contracts were examined. 2 freight companies, fearing involvement in the dispute, renewed their agreements with Luke instead of abandoning him. By February, the pressure around the ranch began to break. Victor Hale stopped appearing. Silas Crowley sent one final offer for the eastern pasture. Luke burned it in the kitchen stove. Sarah watched the paper curl into ash. "You did not read the price." "I already know the answer." Winter slowly loosened its grip. The snow thinned. The cattle moved farther from the shelters. The first brown patches of earth appeared near the barn. The ranch was safe. But the truth Sarah had avoided remained. One evening, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Caleb had fallen asleep, she found Luke at the kitchen table. He was turning something small in his hands. A ring. Not gold. A simple silver band, plain and strong. Sarah stopped in the doorway. Luke stood. "I bought this in Millstone," he said. She could not speak. "I have been carrying it for 3 weeks." "Why?" "Because I did not want to ask while you were afraid." Sarah looked at him. "And now?" "Now I think you might stay because you want to." The kitchen fire moved softly behind them. Luke stepped closer. "I loved Rebecca," he said. "I will always love what we had." Sarah nodded. "I loved Daniel." "I know. He is still part of me. I would never ask otherwise." Luke held the ring between them. "I am not asking you to replace anyone. I am asking whether you and Caleb might build something new with me." Sarah's eyes filled. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of anyone. But some promises belonged to fear, and fear did not deserve loyalty forever. Luke continued, "You have made this house live again. You have made my men remember they are more than hired hands. You have made me notice when I come home." His voice grew rough. "And that boy has trusted me with more than I deserve." Sarah looked toward the hallway. Caleb was standing there. Neither of them had heard him approach. His hair was untidy. He held the repaired wooden horse against his chest. Luke lowered the ring. "Caleb, you should be asleep." "I heard talking." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Come here." He walked into the kitchen. Luke looked suddenly less certain than Sarah had ever seen him. Caleb studied the ring. "Are you asking Mama to marry you?" Luke glanced at Sarah. "Yes." Caleb thought carefully. Then he looked at Luke. "Will we still stay if she says no?" "Yes." "Will I still help in the barn?" "Yes." "Will you still teach me?" Luke's face softened. "As long as you want me to." Caleb looked at his mother. "I think you should say yes." Sarah laughed through her tears. "Do you?" "The cats would miss us." Luke lowered his head, hiding a smile. Sarah looked at the man before her. The lonely rancher who had opened a door when every other door had closed. The man who had repaired a broken toy without trying to replace the hands that first made it. The man who had defended her, listened to her, argued with her, and finally learned to ask what she wanted. She stepped closer. "Yes," she said. Luke looked up. "Yes." "Yes, Luke Bennett, I will marry you." He placed the ring on her finger. It fit. Caleb wrapped his arms around both of them. This time, Luke did not hesitate. He held them. They married in early spring beneath a clear blue sky. Walter Price stood as witness. Jacob wore his best coat and spent most of the ceremony trying not to cry. Amos did not try to hide it. Samuel spoke more words that day than anyone had heard from him in a month. Caleb stood beside Luke. Before the minister began, he handed Luke the wooden horse. "For luck," he said. Luke held it for the entire ceremony. Sarah wore a simple blue dress. She carried no flowers, she needed none. The ranch house windows stood open when they returned. Fresh air moved through the kitchen. Bread cooled on the table. The men had hung a rough wooden sign above the back door. "B&NETT home." The letters were uneven. Sarah loved it. Years later, people in Red Hollow still told the story of the widow who walked 5 miles through a snowstorm with 35 cents and a sick boy. Some said Luke Bennett had saved her. Others said she had saved him. Caleb always corrected them. "They saved the ranch," he would say. "Then the ranch saved all of us." But Sarah knew the truth was quieter than that. No miracle had carried her through the snow. No stranger had arrived at the last moment to erase her grief. She had walked. She had knocked. She had worked. And when Luke asked whether she could run his kitchen, she had done more than cook meals. She had built warmth where silence had lived. She had made a table where lonely men became a family. She had protected the truth when powerful men expected her to lose it. Most of all, she had learned that loving again did not betray the man she had lost. It honored the woman his love had helped her become. On winter mornings, many years later, Sarah still rose before dawn. She still built the stove fire. She still made coffee. And Luke still came into the kitchen before the rest of the ranch woke and sat across from her in the quiet. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they did not. The silence between them was never empty. Outside, Caleb grew into a young man with his father's jaw, his mother's courage, and Luke's patient way with horses. Inside, the kitchen remained warm. Every door that had closed behind Sarah Morgan had led her to the one door that stayed open. She had entered it carrying a suitcase, 35 cents, and a broken-hearted boy. She remained because someone finally asked not what she had lost, but what she could build. And Sarah built a home,